Welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are at a away game today up in Napa Valley. We're sitting with Chef Ken Frank, which is an amazing history. We're going to have a ton of fun on this. Wine Talks is available on Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, you name it. Wherever you hang out for podcasts, you can find Wine Talks. Always sponsored by the Original Wine of the Month Club, where you can get Bordeaux, Pinot Noir, natural wines, whatever your heart's content. So, Chef, I'm not sure where to start because the history you have here is phenomenal. But I got to start with, you were a Poly Tiger. You went to Poly High School?
A Panther.
A Panther.
Why Panther.
Because that's, okay. I never found where it said Panther or Tiger. So it's a Panther. It's a Panther. So that's in Pasadena.
Occidental College was where the Tigers are.
That's right.
And that's where all of my ancestors went, but I was a Poly Panther.
You're a Poly Panther. Then, because we're talking about the San Gabriel Valley folks because Chef grew up in Pasadena, and then he went off to, where'd you go to school after that? Did you go to France after that, right after that?
So I grew up in San Marino, actually, in the house that was built to raise my dad in, on a orange grove that the two aunts that raised my dad ripped out to build houses. I used to drink orange juice every morning from trees that were left in the backyard that were from the original grove.
Wow.
But my parents both taught at Poly, and all of us went to Poly. And in 1972, my dad won what was called the Dudley Wright Grant, where a wealthy benefactor of the school had established a fund, the interest from which, the return on which, was supposed to fund one teacher per year to live off the North American continent with the goal of making the faculty a more worldly influence on the student body over time. So my dad won the second one in 1972, and for my 10th grade year in high school, we moved to a village of 307 people on the French side of Lake Geneva, kind of in between Geneva and Evian on the south side of the lake. I went to French public school.
That's amazing.
We lived in a village. We were immersed in French culture in the middle of nowhere, in a beautiful village that is a historic monument. You can't. It's a walled village.
That's
that was the home of the Duke of Savoy.
So that's the northwest.
It's about 25 minutes east of Geneva on the south side of Lake Geneva, or Lake Le Mans, as they call it.
So what a change from San Marino to a little village town, which you had probably not studied French before that.
I had taken some French in school, and I could count and knew colors and some nouns. But we all went to French public school, so I went to French public school for what would have been my 10th grade year in high school.
How was that for you as a transplant?
Was
amazing,
awesome.
Yeah,
we rode. My sister and I'm the oldest of five. We rode a bus every day, for half an hour through 7 villages to the larger town of, 800 people where the school was.
Big town. 300 to 800, right?
It had a stoplight.
So the assimilating to the French culture, particularly one is that village life, really it's different than what a Parisian would experience. For a young San Marino child.
Very much so, but we had a blast.
Did you?
The reason my dad chose that location was because he was aiming for Geneva, and he found a house for rent in the village of Ivoire, where we were, on a little classified ad in the back of Gourmet magazine.
Wow.
We know the family that still owns that house and have visited since a couple of times. It's a pretty interesting story. That's still my French village. I have great friends there.
So I just trying to place this because you moved there, and was it at that time that the French culture, the French food, which is probably a little different than the haute cuisine we're going to talk about, but was there an aha moment at that point as a child?
Well, the aha moment for me was, first of all, everything in France tasted better.
Of course.
I've always liked to eat. Even from my earliest days, I have always liked to eat. It wasn't always.
Well, you stay pretty thin.
You don't understand. In my family, I'm the fat one.
Oh, really?
It's genes. I am the fat one in my family. Yeah. But I've always liked to eat. I used to spend weekends at my grandfather's house, and he grew up on a farm in the San Fernando Valley when there were 2 farms. I operated a locker plant in Eagle Rock, California, called Eagle Rock Frosty Foods, which was essentially a walk-in freezer of the size of this dining room that had lockers in it. And he had a butcher shop in the front, and people would buy a quarter or a half of a steer, and he'd cut it to order and wrap it and put it in the freezer and then give you a key. You would come in once or twice a week and take out of your locker what you wanted to take home and put in your icebox.
What a great strategy.
And, you know, I used to get to put sawdust on the floor, but he was a really good cook, and he did everything, and a huge influence on me. And, you know, I would spend weekends at his house, and, you know, we didn't make pancakes. We made flapjacks, which are when you flip them in the air and catch them in the pan. And to me, that was magical.
I consider myself quite the, you know, with eggs for sure.
But so I've always loved to eat. And the real aha moment for me was the cafeteria at school in Duven was run by 3 women from that village, and they served us all. There were probably 150 kids at school. So they served us all in 2 shifts at tables of 8, family style, French country meal every lunch that was always multi-courses. There was always dessert or cheese. And it was stews, braised meats, roasted. It was food better food than Americans were eating in restaurants, because these women were cooking French country food on a very interesting menu. And I gained 40 pounds that year.
Wow, oh, really?
Yeah, I grew like 4 inches. I went from one of the smallest kids in my class to one of the taller, but still skinny.
That's, you know, there was a Bourdain episode with was it Brulo's? Dan Boulot, which chef? And Bourdain did it. He went to a small school and saw the food, and I thought to myself, wow, what are we missing in America at that level to appreciate good food when the kids are eating this, well, I'm not going to say it, but slop that they get served.
There was no comparison. As I said, it was better food than most Americans were seeing in even good restaurants.
Why do you think that? Why do you think we can't do that?
Well, in fact, we can. And a lot has changed, and I was just really fortunate to start when I did. And I started at the right time to ride this great wave of great food that has come to be the norm in America. America was an underperforming country in terms of food 40, 50 years ago, and we have become an exception. We have more ethnic diversity and more excitement about a great diverse food scene in this country than almost anywhere else. I mean, we have a world-class food scene in America, and that was just not the case 40, 50 years ago.
It seems, if you go back to that time, let's just say the entry of Le Pavillon in New York, the Lutesses of the world, the haute cuisine. So, and there's a great book from Patrick Hugh called The Last Days of Haute Cuisine about the evolution to Chez Panisse, you know, what happened in America, and sort of the societal changes that occurred as well. So define haute cuisine for me, and then we'll define nouvelle cuisine, and then we're going to talk about how L.A. became this sort of hotbed of that movement.
So haute cuisine, or as they called it in the 70s, hot cuisine,
yes, right,
because they didn't know better, was very much defined by, I think the best way to describe it is very much based on the cooking of Escoffier.
Yes.
Where there was a very good, very high level of technique, but very standardized vision of what a great dish was. And there was a list of ingredients that had to go into that dish in a way that dish needed to be made that was paramount. It was not particularly seasonal. It was a very rigid hierarchy. And that's when I started cooking here in the U.S. So my cooking in France, so just to back up quickly.
Yeah.
So French public school was awesome. I had an amazing French girlfriend who's still a friend to this day, and I desperately wanted to stay. So my parents said, well, if you can get a job and find a family to live with, you can spend the summer. Same day,
right.
Had a family to live with and had a job as a dishwasher in one of the hotels in the village. Girlfriend dumped me right after that, but I stayed anyway.
Well, you know,
but I spent the summer after my 10th grade year in high school, I spent that summer in Ivoire working in a kitchen, starting as a dishwasher.
Wow.
And then I graduated to cutting and blanching the French fries and rolling out the tart shells. And then I graduated into essentially being a kitchen slave. But I mean, I started to actually learn how to cook, and I absolutely learned how to work in a kitchen efficiently and hustle. I came back for my junior year in school in Pasadena. I got a job flipping hamburgers on the weekend at Mount Waterman Ski Resort to make the money to buy my plane ticket to go back to Ivoire for the next summer, which I did. And the next summer, I was a full-on cook in the kitchen.
Same place.
Same place, same program, having the time of my life as now a 17-year-old in France.
Amazing.
All by myself, living with the same family. And when I came back for my senior year in high school, I got a job working after school in a French restaurant in Pasadena called Chez Paul that was aiming to be the finest restaurant Pasadena had ever had. And the owner had hired a famous French chef out of retirement in Florida who was the original French chef at Le Pavillon in New York when they opened.
Wow. So he worked
He's
for
the chef that Charles de Gaulle had chosen to cook for Queen Elizabeth when de Gaulle invited her to visit Paris.
He got trained by Soleil on that.
He was the executive chef at the Crillon Hotel in Paris and a Meilleur Ouvrier de France when de Gaulle invited him to cook for Queen Elizabeth. So this guy was the real deal. And
he was at Chez Paul in Pasadena.
Yes, out of retirement. And he took me under his wing and exposed me to, I mean, I was the pantry man, but I worked harder than anybody else. And he exposed me and trained me to do things that I had never even imagined were part of cuisine because I'd seen a very simple, hearty, delicious French cuisine. The family I lived with were lake fishermen, so we ate fish every day. I paid my room and board by filleting fish in the morning before I went to work at the hotel in the basement.
That's great.
But the French food I'd been exposed to was delicious but simple, humble country fare. And now we were using canned truffles, and I was learning how to make soufflés. And
so this Escoffier style is, and this gentleman coming from Le Pavillon and Amaf as well. Is that the kind of food? Is it still Escoffier? I mean, Escoffier was...
So that would be 1974 and 1975.
So it's still haute cuisine, I think. Yeah.
Haute cuisine was the big deal.
Yeah.
San Francisco, with places like Ernie's, was still deemed to be more sophisticated than Los Angeles at the time.
Well, I mean...
That would soon change.
It made its way. It made its way west. Lutèce was, I think, of haute cuisine as well.
Oh, absolutely.
All sauces, the 5 mother sauces, just prepared different ways and heavy. I think my wife's bridal shower was at Chez Paul in like 80. When did it close? 80.
I was there in 74, and it was around 6, 7, 8 years, something like that.
So that's a pretty phenomenal story that you go back to France. How was your French then? I mean, were you...
By the time I got to the end of my first school year in France, I spoke near perfect French.
Oh, because that's almost impossible to do. So.
I was very fortunate to, your brain starts to solidify somewhere between 15 and 18.
Right.
And I was young enough, so I had the intellectual capacity to do a lot of learning, but I didn't have that solidification that keeps you from learning. Believe me, I speak Spanish every day with my crew. I've been speaking Spanish every day for 40 years. My Spanish still sucks.
Yeah, you just can't.
But as a kid, going to school, immersed in school, living in a village where nobody spoke English, there was no choice but to learn to speak French, and I picked it up really quickly. And when we go to France now, people assume I'm French because I have almost no accent.
That's amazing because I've been studying it. My father speaks. He's 92, and I thought I'll learn it. So I started about 5 years ago. Every day, 3 days a week, I'm on a website talking to somebody in Paris or Lyon or some places like that, and it's just a very difficult language.
By the time you're 20, your ability to absorb a new language as if it was...
It's like a brick.
Second nature is very, very difficult.
It's really hard.
It has nothing to do with how smart you are. It's just the way the brain works.
So one of the things I'm catching from all this, and you worked hard in this industry. Our daughter's a boulangère in New York. They just earned a Michelin star at Benno, and then it closed thanks to COVID. But you're stumbling across this idea and this effort that it takes. And I'm wondering your concept of today's culinary schools, which I think what's his name just closed the one in New York where Saltner is. But so many kids go into this culinary school thinking I'm going to be a TV chef and the celebrity chef of that style, not celebrity chef in that you make great food, but I'm on TV, and realize that this is a very difficult, hard-working business. But it sounds like you were doing that already. You already were so passionate about doing this that you worked in a kitchen in a small village in France, and you came to America, and you just were the hardest working guy at Chez Paul. Is that not the premise of how to do this properly?
That is, I believe that is the best way to do this.
Yeah.
Culinary schools don't like to hear this, but you cannot learn to be a great chef at culinary school.
No.
If you don't have it in you, you don't have it in you. By that same token, if you do have it in you, you don't need school. You need to get a job.
Just work.
You need to get a job. Lots of people that graduate from culinary school go on to have nice careers. Few of them end up celebrity chefs, and the whole celebrity and chef thing is really unfortunate anyway, because celebrity is conflated with talent, and they are actually culinary talent and celebrity are completely unrelated.
Yes.
There are plenty of celebrity chefs that can't cook their way out of a paper bag, but they're fun on television and they're fun to watch. There's a couple of them that are terrific chefs. Emeril Lagasse would be one example.
Yes.
Wolfgang Puck is another example. Now disgraced Mario Batali, another example. Those guys can really, really cook. Plenty of other ones, they make good TV. And how many TV chefs does America need? You know,
who knows? The Food Network needs them more than anybody.
To me,
right?
the real mark of a good chef, and this was something that I first heard expressed best by Charlie Trotter, was a chef who owns his own restaurant and is his own master, and whose style of cooking and his mastery of the kitchen is enough to make him successful on his own terms. That is a great chef.
That's a real chef.
Someone who has enough stuff in them to do their thing in a way that makes enough people want to pay for it. That's how you define a really good chef. And I think that's a really very good way to put it. But
Makes
it's
sense.
hard work. You work long hours. You train a long time. It takes just as long to learn to become a really good chef as it does to become a doctor or any number of other very sophisticated, very complicated jobs. It takes a type of personality. You need to be able to be a businessman and an artist. You need to multitask. You have to handle stress by the bucket. And it's not for everyone. I happen to love my job. I wouldn't do anything else. But I've grown into it. It's what I've always done. It's who I am, and it's what I love to do. There's a lot of kids come through my kitchen, and they're really terrific people, and they're really good cooks, and they work hard, and they get to 30 or 32, and they realize they're not going to be lucky. They're not going to get to be me. They're certainly not going to be famous. It's going to be hard for them to own their own restaurant and make a really good living, let alone raise a family, because it's a night job and it's a hard job. But if it's what you got to do, it's what you got to do. And I know most really great chefs got stuck on the same slippery slope that I did. Once you start it, if you love it, you can't. It's addictive. You can't not do it. Cooking for people and making people happy with food is all about dopamine. It feels great.
I think that's the difference. And our daughter has this. The fermentation sciences of bread. She's a baker. It thrills her, and the hours don't bother her.
If you don't love the job,
yeah, it's impossible.
It
right?
will kill you.
Yeah. So how do you? Most of the kids that come into your kitchen, maybe they have gone to Greystone and gone to cooking school, and they come in. They say, "I have this degree," and you put them on the line. Are they looking, you think, probably as a career to think, I'm going to own my own restaurant one day, because they don't know how hard that is right now? But
so there's two kinds of cooks that you see going through kitchens. And since I own and operate the entire food and beverage department here at the Westin, I have both. In my back kitchen, I have a fantastic prep crew. These are people, this is their career. They're really good. Among other things, I eat the best Mexican food in the world almost every day.
family meals, Mexican.
Not even family meal. They make great family meals, but then there's also kitchen meals. And because I eat every level of spice and I love what they do, they cook really great, very flavorful Mexican food. But these are people with families and careers who work really hard, who don't want to be me. They have great jobs, they have benefits, they're raising families. It's the American dream. That's track number one. Track number two is the young American kids that want to be me. And their dream is to work on the line in La Toque, in the Michelin-star restaurant, put that on their resume, and then go work in another one, and go work in another one, and build their resume, and make it all the way to the top and be the best chef that ever lived. And that's a very different track. That's driven by a passion, which is necessary. It is often not driven by realistic goals, but it's something, they're invariably young. We get the best of them here because we select them out pretty hard. But, you know, a minority of them will go on to be truly successful and, you know, happy into their 40s, 50s, and 60s doing what they do.
Well, do you think then the migration of food from haute cuisine to nouvelle cuisine, and we'll define that in a second, but you landing in the LA scene at the time that you landed and the evolution of food in Los Angeles, which is, you know, I don't think LA was a hotbed of food prior to those years, the years where you were, well, this book was written around, which is, by the way, for the listeners, this is a great book called Chefs, Drugs, and Rock and Roll by Andrew Friedman. It chronicles really the LA scene and America's movement toward nouvelle cuisine and restaurants like this. Was this an accident? How did this happen that you ended up in part of the mix of this movement in Los Angeles?
Very simply, I was in the right place at the right time. This was not my plan. I loved to cook. The year I lived in France absolutely changed my life. That was a total accident. I was in the right place at the right time. When I left, I graduated and moved down to Newport Beach to go to UC Irvine. And I was taking biology. I was either going to go pre-med or marine biology because I still love marine biology. I mean, I'm a marine fish geek. I have a reef aquarium. I'm a geeky guy. I like that kind of thing. But after 3 months, so first thing I did was get a job at the best restaurant in Newport Beach as cook. It was called Ambrosia at the time. It was run by a couple of German guys. It was the best restaurant in Newport Beach, most expensive by a mile. It's where I actually made a Grand Marnier souffle for Richard Nixon.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
Because he had exiled himself to San Clemente, and Ambrosia was the best restaurant around. But after 3 months, I decided that I hated school. I had nothing in common with the other kids that were on the pre-med track that just wanted to be doctors because they were going to make a lot of money. And I loved the science. I hated school, and I loved cooking. And somewhat inspired by the chef Ernest Didier, who was the chef at Chez Paul when I was 17 and 18, that had inspired. I mean, he inspired me with how there was a whole level of great cuisine that I had never even imagined, and how it was really a fascinating, noble career. And until then, I'd seen cooking as a fun job, and I was making money. I had money to spend. I had a nice car. You know, when you're making decent money and you're a senior in high school with a full-time job, you got money to spend. You're doing okay. You don't have a social life, but you got money.
Yeah.
And I decided, you know, I don't want to do this. And I took a leave of absence from UC Irvine that I'm still on today.
Good.
I moved back up to Los
Just
Angeles.
in case, right?
Yeah, and I got a job at Perino's, which was the inspiration for Chez Paul. And in its very final days, though still regarded as the classic LA restaurant of certainly the 50s and 60s.
It was downtown, right?
And downtown on Wilshire, just a couple blocks west of Western.
Yeah. I remember the restaurant. So,
and from there, I went to La Chaumière in Beverly Hills, where I spent a year, and then I went through a number of other restaurant jobs. And, you know, most of what I know, I mean, I started cooking in France, but what I serve, the high-end cooking that I do, is self-taught, working in the U.S. and honestly, mostly working in my own kitchen because I opened La Toque when I was 23 years old. So
which is amazing.
I've learned most of what I've learned working for myself in my own kitchen.
So, but I don't believe in luck. I think it's preparation meets opportunity. I think it's the classic definition. And certainly, I suppose your father moving to France was maybe a little bit of luck, but he was prepared to do this. He applied for it. He wanted to try it.
Absolutely.
And you landed there, and you fell in love with it. And when you got back to L.A., and I'm thinking about going back a little bit to the kids that come out of culinary school and some of the trek that seems to be necessary to at least give yourself a shot. For instance, cooking overseas, cooking in Paris, cooking in France, cooking in wherever, Italy, as part of this career movement. And then you find yourself now having this experience, and you land in Los Angeles. There's this crazy movement. You know, I'm friends actually with the descendant of Kavkaz, the Markarians, who were Spago. Wolfgang Puck bought the restaurant. What was happening in Los Angeles then? Why was this movement? Had it left New York? Because I think Lutèce was still around at that time. I think Le Pavillon closed like in the late 70s. So
New York was still the gold standard. What happened, and when I started cooking in Los Angeles, haute cuisine, Escoffier-based cuisine was still king. French cuisine was still king.
Yeah.
What happened was Americans, consumers, started traveling more. When I started cooking, all Italian restaurants were spaghetti and meatballs. Valentino's did not yet Valentino's did not yet exist.
Really? Yeah.
Piero was on his way here from Sicily.
Wow.
Johnny didn't have Paponis yet. And Valentino started as a meatball and red sauce place, and it grew into what many people considered the finest Italian restaurant outside of Italy for decades. And LA was ripe for this because Californians were traveling more and eating in France more modern food. France had started to modernize its food with Nouvelle cuisine. Americans were traveling to Italy and discovering that pasta could be fresh. That Italian cuisine was more than spaghetti and meatballs and pizza, and that pizza was actually made with a very thin crust that was supposed to be crispy. It was nothing like the slice is only good if you can fold it in half and it holds up.
Right.
So the consumers started traveling more. They were very curious, and chefs started migrating west. And the great advantage that California had was California's bounty, which we still enjoy today. I mean, cooking local and seasonal when you live in California is easy. I mean, we're really good at it, but let's be honest, it's easy here. And it's easier here in the Bay Area than almost anywhere on the planet. We are surrounded by purveyors and farmers and a network of food suppliers that is the equal to any on the planet at this point. It's always been easy in California. If you try to do this in Iowa, you try to do this in Michigan, it's really hard.
Corn. You get
so
corn.
Chefs, young European chefs were drawn to the West Coast. Young Europeans like, for example, Wolfgang Puck. And what happens when Wolfgang Puck runs into the bounty of California? Well, we all know what happened. So chefs in California, most of them French trained because French was still king, though that was about, the French took themselves for granted and got lapped by the Italians for some time. Chefs in California started to improvise. They started to cook with California ingredients. They started to do things that were really seasonal. They started to demand vegetables that were fresher. They started to look for products that were exceptional. The big shift from classic cuisine to nouvelle cuisine, there's a number of factors. One, with classic cuisine, the owner of the restaurant was paramount. The owner of the restaurant had the money and determined the style and the menu, and the chef came in and saw the menu and had a book and figured out how to make all of the things on the menu and faithfully executed the classic menu that the owner wanted. Maybe there were some specials, but for the most part, the chef was a worker who executed the menu that ownership wanted.
So proprietor-centric.
Yes. But in the 70s, in France and quickly elsewhere, restaurants became more chef-centric. Restaurants were owned by the chef, most famously and first Paul Bocuse and Fernand Point. Mm-hmm. So while they were still cooking classic food in the beginning, they were owning the restaurant. And then when they decided to be a little bit creative, that's when the whole Nouvelle thing got unleashed, and it was a little out of control for a while. But basically what that was doing was that was freeing up chefs to be creative. So I started cooking in the very last few years of rigid classic cooking, and I learned great technique. But when I was just coming into my own, in my early 20s, was when chefs were released from that duty and allowed to be creative and do things their own way and start to reimagine things and do things that were necessarily lighter, more modern, perhaps a fusion. Certainly in California, adapting to the things that were available here that we had to work with. So notably in California is where French chefs first started to encounter. You started to see French chefs using Oriental ingredients on menus.
Mm-hmm.
Ginger, sesame.
Wow.
California, being closer to Japan in particular, had a tremendous Japanese influence. Los Angeles, being the import center for Japanese cars into this country, quickly grew a deep, wealthy, culturally rich Japanese, diaspora, which spawned really great Japanese restaurants, which spawned imports from Tokyo of really great things. So California became a very exciting, dynamic place to be. It drew chefs. Farmers started to grow more interesting things and started working directly with chefs. What do you want me to grow? Which is something that is huge now, but it was just starting. Farmers market started.
Real farmers
for a
markets.
while in the 80s. Los Angeles was briefly perhaps the most exciting food city in the country. San Francisco caught back up. New York caught back up. They were perhaps a little later to awaken to this nouvelle. But as you would read in the book, Chefs, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, chefs on the East Coast were they were unknown, and in San Francisco. I mean, we didn't really know each other that well in the very beginning, but we were all experiencing the same things. We were all coming back from Europe. We were all looking for better ingredients, and none of us had a great plan. We were just doing what we loved to do, and we were kind of all following the same path.
Was Chez Panisse sort of that launching point for that change? Was that part of the culture, or was that sort of?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, some people
Chez
say
Panisse,
that.
in its early days, Chez Panisse was a very, very amateur restaurant.
Yeah.
It was certainly not.
Well, it sounded like that the way they started.
Oh,
really.
and it was for some time. There was another restaurant in Berkeley that was considered equally seminal, which was Narcisse. It was a very amateur restaurant, and there were certainly better chefs cooking better food in other places.
You said
but
two
Chez
things.
Panisse was an idea that had legs and grew into what I think is a great American restaurant, and I can't wait for them to reopen because my dad still lives in Berkeley, and I like to take him to lunch.
It did. I mean, from what I've read about it, as I'm reading the story, I'm thinking, gee, it doesn't sound like the formula for something that as popular as it is today. You said two things during this last conversation there. One was the Poins of the world and the Bocuse and the Trois Gros and that generation owning restaurants. Those still are generationally run restaurants. The Trois Gros brothers, I think, didn't the Poin's wife take over?
Oh, yeah.
When he passed away.
And Sophie Pic is running the Pic restaurants now.
So, and I have a book of the great L.A. restaurants. I think just before you got into the scene, you're talking about Musso and Frank's and L'Ermitage, and not L'Ermitage, but Le Grand Orange. So, L'Orangerie, wait.
I opened L'Orangerie.
Did you?
Yes.
Was Nancy there then at that time?
No. There were two French chefs at L'Orangerie that they had brought over from France, and they spoke no English. So they hired me as a sous chef, and I set them up with purveyors and helped get their kitchen hired and trained. And
So the point is made is that those generational restaurants, it seems so different than Los Angeles or even America in general. That in France it was so important, and cuisine was a major part of their lifestyle, as you experienced as a younger man. That we don't see that as much here. That restaurants seem to come and go. Once the chef is done, they feel like it doesn't get taken over. Do you agree with that, or do you think that we're now going to enter into that generational handoff of restaurants?
I don't see that. Restaurants are fragile. It's the very unusual restaurant that has real legs. Restaurants are first of all, they're just fragile. Most restaurants don't last very long at all.
It's very hard
A
to make money.
5-year run is considered a success.
Yeah, right.
Less than a year is the norm. A decade is enormous. Decades is one in I don't know how many thousands. And that's largely true in Europe as well.
Is it? Okay.
There are institutions in Europe that do manage that generational shift. But in any business, generational shifts are hard. And the restaurant business is a particularly hard business.
It's very hard.
I mean,
Her cousin owns a restaurant in Pasadena. This is on its 30th year. And we're shocked. He's shocked.
well, the higher you aim and the more stylish you are, the harder it is to have any kind of longevity.
Yeah.
Because restaurant trends are like fashion.
Yeah.
They are constantly evolving. What's exciting at the high end of this business is the learning curve never slows down. I mean, what I'm cooking today is very different from what I was cooking 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, let alone 15 years ago, let alone 40 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to constantly learn and adapt and grow all the time. And that is not something everyone is able to do. To remain relevant for decades and decades is kind of like being a musician who remains relevant for decades and decades.
I think Friedman talks about that, about some of these chefs like Joachim and Wolfgang Puck and you as being like, you can't predict the future, but you can continue to lab the kitchen so you see what's happening. So when did you start Le Toque in Los Angeles?
I opened Le Toque in 1979.
Why?
A few days shy of my 24th birthday.
Phenomenal. And how was that financed?
I had 12 backers called founders. Patrick Turay, then owner of Ma Maison and Wolfgang's boss at the time, sat down with me and said, Ken, I think it's time for you to have your own restaurant, and this is how you do it.
Wow.
And I borrowed $5,000 from 12 different people and bought half of a restaurant that was in dire need of a good chef, and that's how Le Toque got started. He gave me the name Le Toque. He told me what to call it. He told me how to finance it. I called up a number of my best customers. It took me about a week to raise the money, and away we went.
It seems at that time too, according to the book, the maturity of your cooking maturity and the maturity of the industry. I mean, it was the 80s, let's face it, the 70s and the 80s, and I worked in corporate America. I mean, it was drugs and it was, infidelity, and it was just loaded with divorce. I mean, everything was going on. And it sounds like in the food business, it was pretty much happening as well, partying all night and getting up and just having a blast in the kitchen. But it seems like at that time when you started Le Toque, things started to settle down a little bit. A little more maturity with the industry. Is that accurate or no?
No,
not really.
That didn't come along for probably another 10 years. I had just gotten married when I opened Le Toque, and we had our son.
Add more stress to the whole thing.
And we had
right?
our son the next year, and then shortly after that was when I got Guillain-Barré syndrome and was paralyzed.
Oh,
so
no.
my path diverged from a lot of the flashier characters in the book at that point, as I was forced to grow up just because of the realities of what happened to me in my life.
Yeah.
But the excesses that are touched on in the book, which are sadly not portrayed as fully as they should be, because a number of people were reluctant to be as open as they could have been. A lot of those excesses went well into the 80s.
I would say, corporate America like that, 85, 86. Well, add some stress to your life. You open a restaurant, you get married, and you have a child. I mean, that's a lot of moving parts.
And then I got sick.
And then you got sick.
I've worked the cold station in the original Le Toque station kitchen in a wheelchair, and then
Wow.
moved to the line when I was on crutches. I weighed
Wow.
118 pounds when I got out of the hospital.
And is it a disease of a central nervous system disease?
It's an autoimmune disorder that was poorly understood then and is still somewhat misunderstood. It's somewhat similar to Lou Gehrig's syndrome, though you typically get over it.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never had a flu shot, and I'm not going to be a candidate for a coronavirus vaccine either because
of that.
Because there was some correlation between the flu shots during Jimmy Carter's presidency and a heightened level of Guillain-Barré, and they're still very cautious of anyone that's ever had it getting immunized.
I got to be safe. So I want to.
That's one of the reasons we are so careful
Yeah.
about coronavirus here, because I'm not a candidate for a vaccine. So
No, I can see the place is spotless. That's for sure. In the kitchen, I notice everybody's wearing a mask in the kitchen, and that's one of the subjects I want to talk about too. May not have time, but the French kitchen is such a polishly clean kitchen. My daughter, having taken classes there, she went to Alain Decasse's pastry school and then worked in Paris. And one of the things she came back with is like the kitchens here are phenomenally clean and required to be sponged out every hour, or a few hours it seems like. But you touched on something that I wanted to get back to: the quality of the food, organic versus biodynamic versus conventional, the seasonality of food in Los Angeles. Dan Barber's Blue Hill Farm, having growing things, and you mentioned in the book that you were sitting in a meeting with, I think it was McCarty, and he was talking about the duck farms that really didn't exist. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, because isn't that what Blue Hill Farms is predicated on? Like we grow the cows, and we raise the cows here. And
well, the difference is that Dan Barber has a wealthy patron who can afford to do it right.
That's right. So.
And the reality is that when I was at Michael's, Michael had copied most of Michael's, including the kitchen design and the Villeroy and Bach and Christophe Le tabletop from L'Hermitage, where Jean Bertranu had been gracious enough to let Michael hang out and observe for better part of the year before Michael's opened. And when we opened, Ruth Reichel was writing for New West magazine at the time. I think it was New West before it became California magazine. Mm-hmm. She spent a week with us in the kitchen at Michael's. That's what spawned that famous picture, actually. And she wrote an article about it, and in the article, she asked Michael, well, how did you hire all these young Americans? And he said, well, it's simply because they don't want to work for a crusty old bastard like Jean Bertranu. Okay. And when Jean Bertranu read that, he was deeply offended.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, personally. And so he cut Michael off from access to the purveyors that he had developed, for example, the ducks the smoked salmon that were on the menu at Michael's. And we were buying Long Island ducks, a really good Long Island duck, mind you, from Gus Meat Company, from Harvey Gussman.
Yeah.
That was the same ducks that every other really good French restaurant in Los Angeles was buying.
But not from the ranch.
Michael has always been, let me say, a great storyteller.
Yeah, right.
And I sat in an interview with him, and then food critic from the Los Angeles Times, Lois Dwan, sat in another one with Mary Rourke, who was writing for W at the time. And he told them stories about the restaurant that he'd owned in Paris and that he still owned the property. His dream was to go back one day and reopen his restaurant in Paris. And it's like, I mean, the man had an ability to tell stories that it remains unmatched.
Well, Melvin Masters says, that who's a friend of mine, he says, he was full of BS, but it was genuine BS. Like he really probably believed it when he was saying it. So I have a question. I have a food question. Chef Splichal and I are friends through acquaintances in food and wine, and he has that winery in the Provence. And I asked him this question the other day because I was making a Escoffier sauce tomate, and he goes, this is about 3 months ago, he goes, don't do it now. He goes, they're out of season, and you have to have, they're soon. I guess they're in season now, or they're just were.
Tomatoes are
amazing,
crazy right now.
So if we went to Santa Monica, chef's market, and we both you bought organic, in-season fruits and vegetables, and I went to Ralph's and bought the same in-season vegetables and fruits, And we came back to the kitchen and we prepared them identical, same temperatures, same process, everything. Does the organic necessarily, generally, taste better?
No.
Not.
Organic is a overrated word. It's an ideal. It's a good ideal.
In the wine business too, but that's why I wanted to know.
Organic does force farmers to pay much more attention and farm more carefully. It is a great goal to reduce and eliminate use of poisonous chemicals and fertilizers. To farm organically, you have to work harder and you have to do things very, very well. It takes a lot of work, and it's absolutely better for the earth. But whether you farm certifiably organic or whether you follow those principles is kind of immaterial to me. If you grow things responsibly and they're delicious and they're in season, I'm not concerned that you're certified or not. And I don't believe, and there's quite a bit of scientific evidence that points to the direction that organic foods don't contain better nutrients. I mean, the vitamins that they contain and the nutrients that they contain are actually the same. Are they better for the planet? Absolutely. Should they be something we aspire to? Absolutely. Should we take better care of our farmland? Absolutely. But they don't necessarily taste better. They don't and they're not necessarily better for you. But there is a lot of validity to chasing organics and trying to make everything as natural and healthy and sustainable and responsible as we can. Just slapping the name organic on it, I don't think is particularly the right word.
I can't tell you how many vegetables that we bought from the well-known organic food store were bitter, particularly the carrots, where there's no bricks at all, no sugar.
If they aren't picked at the right time,
doesn't matter.
And if they aren't, it's harder to grow things organically, and so it's harder to make them delicious. So we get a lot of organic stuff here. We buy twice a week from a fairly new collective over in Sonoma called FEED Sonoma, and it's a collective of farms that grow a wide variety of things who pool together for delivery. So on Sunday we log on and we see what's available from 25, 30 small farms that really grow amazing stuff. And you place your order and you get it on Tuesday, and we'll place another order on Wednesday for Friday.
Wow.
And we get to pick and choose as if we were at a farmer's market, but we buy case quantities. We pay a delivery fee, and they pool their deliveries, and it's delivered by a driver who drops it all off. So we'll get an invoice with 18 items on it from 9 different farms.
And the purveyors, you understand how they grow, you've used the foods.
And it's absolutely seasonal, and none of it travels more than 25 miles.
Yeah,
and
great.
It is immaculately beautiful produce.
So in the wine business, we have this issue, and it's and the French just started vente méthode sans ajout. What's sulfur in French?
Sans soufre.
Yeah. So they started this. What it means, and what's weird to me is it's only a 3-year trial. They've been working on it for 10 years. But it means it's dry farmed, it means it's hand picked, and it means that there's no added sulfites. So let's say it's less than 30 parts per million or something. But I taste a lot of really bad organic wines, and particularly biodynamic wines. And my daughter dragged us to a Brooklyn wine shop, and we bought a $75 Nero d'Avola from Sicily because it was biodynamic, and it was undrinkable. So after I taste these wines, and you get this sort of wet hay character, and I'm thinking to myself, why would I want to drink this? It's not a pleasurable experience. I'm not doing myself any real favors by drinking it, but it's pretty trendy to have them. And then I realized after I've been tasting these wines, this is my 30th year, I've tasted a lot of organic wines that are not labeled, not certified, but farmed that way because the family wants to farm that way, because they don't want their kids crawling around in pesticides when they're out in the vineyards. And that's just a noble, common sense approach. I understand that you're quite, as the chef in the chefdom world, as a wine oriented, you have a affinity towards wine, and you pair wines all the time. Of course, we try to do that, but tell me your opinion of, or your concentration of wine here at La Toque, and how you represent it, how the servers represent the list.
Well, we have, we're one of only 100 restaurants in the world to have a Wine Spectator Grand Award.
Wow.
We have
Yeah.
approximately 2,300 selections on the list. This is a
huge.
list that we've been building over the last 22 years that I've been in Napa Valley. And over that time, the world of wine has evolved and changed, and it's going to continue to.
Yep.
In general, the world of wine is simply getting better. More people are carefully growing really great, interesting wine in more places than ever before. I think California and Napa Valley and Robert Mondavi in particular get an enormous amount of credit for showing the world that you can grow great wine somewhere else. It was that kind of vision and that kind of dedication to constantly improving and trying new things and striving for quality that I think the success of Napa Valley and California's wine country in particular was instrumental in getting other wine growing regions outside of Bordeaux and Burgundy inspired that they too could do great things. It coincided with a great academic effort to understand more about the science and the best practices. So there was a great sharing of best practices between California and France in particular, epitomized perhaps by Opus One, which was one great example of two cultures getting the best out of each other. All of a sudden, wines in Spain were being made more carefully. Wines in Italy were being made more carefully. People were thinking more about new best practices. All of a sudden, we were seeing wines coming from places that we never expected to see wine come from. New Zealand makes fantastic Pinot Noir and Sauvignon Blanc. We're seeing wine from Eastern Europe. We're seeing wine from all sorts of places. And what stands out is that it's mostly the result of people working really hard, really carefully to grow what should be grown where it is, and not adhering necessarily to one style, trying to let those varieties and the places that they're from express themselves at their highest possible level. And I think it's a really exciting time to be active in the wine world today. When I started, Bordeaux and Burgundy were the name of the game.
That was it, yeah.
And then California Cabernet kind of took over for a while. But the world of wine has diversified the same way as the world of food has, and it's a really exciting time.
Something anecdotal, I interviewed Emmanuel Camigi, who's making wines in Purat and San Ynez Valley, oddly. And
We buy them both.
do you really? Oh, yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you know,
Oh, his wines are fantastic.
they are great. So he says in the interview, he says, when I got my MS, a Master Sommelier, what did I have to know? I had to know a little bit about Argentina, but mostly Burgundy and France and maybe some things in Spain. He goes, I went to see Daryl Cordy, and he poured me an Armenian wine. I happen to be Armenian. He goes, now, not only do I have to compete against these people, I have to learn about them because it's an area that has been growing wine for 6,000 years or some number, and now they have technologies to make quality wines, and they use their indigenous grapes. And I want to finish on this one thought because this is almost going on an hour already. But it is that what you said, and that is growing grapes in the regions they belong and where they flourish and where they express themselves, and Pinot being like one of the best for that. But tell me about, briefly, the evolution of food in the days of Catherine Medici and the regional. And I have this affinity for the idea that the Bordelais drink Bordeaux and they have the foods of Bordeaux, and Burgundy is the same way, and Spain, all the rest of it. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why you sit at a trattoria in front of the Parthenon and you have a low-end table wine that's just well curated, and you have the experience of your life because it's this whole range. It's the food and the wine and what you're doing.
Well, it really boils down to a fundamental fact of human history, is that we are very adaptable, and we eat and we drink what we have. And when people have been eating and drinking what they have, where they are, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, they get really good at it. So when you drink a glass of rosé in Provence and you eat the food of Provence, it fits together in a way that just seems magical. Because, in fact, for generations and generations and generations, the people that live there have made the wine that they could make there, and eaten the food that they could eat there because that's what they had.
That's
and over time, they've become really good at it. That's why it works. In Italy, that's why every little corner of Italy is different, because every little corner of Italy was its own isolated little place that figured out what to do with what they had. And they waste nothing.
Yeah.
And they make it delicious.
It's a phenomenon that I don't want. It drives me nuts, and I'm not a snob. I mean, I taste a lot of wine. I sell wine. That's my business. But it makes me nuts when I see people bring Duckhorn Merlot to what would be a fairly indigenous restaurant, Italian restaurant in Los Angeles. And not that it doesn't work. It certainly can work. But I'm like, but let the somm there, let the guy that wrote the list express himself or herself with the foods that he's
with one of the 50 Italian varietals you've never heard of and you can't spell, that in the hands of a good somm is phenomenally delicious.
Yes.
That's well chosen, that you've never heard of, that you should try. And that's one of the things that we have the most success with here, that I particularly enjoy, is we sell the wine pairing to 2/3 of the guests that do our tasting menu.
Really? Wow.
And invariably,
that's a great number.
We pour wines for them that they would never choose for themselves. And to me, that's one of the great things we can do, is we can introduce things to people that are absolutely delicious that they wouldn't otherwise know.
We have to do that.
And that means that I don't just pour Napa Valley wine.
Right.
We pour Nebbiolo, we pour wine from Spain, we pour a lot of German and Austrian Riesling because it happens to go really well with some of the dishes. And let's face it, I'm not going to buy Riesling and Gruner Veltliner from Napa Valley because they don't really do that well here. You might find one, but you won't find 50. And you won't find one that's as good as the best examples where they came from.
I was embarrassed the other night. We were at the press, and I was going to order a Bordeaux, and I decided I can't do that at the press, so I ordered a Napa Valley.
Well, Chef, when you're in Napa Valley and you've got a restaurant with a great wine list that has Napa Valley Bordeaux-style wine that is 10 to 20 years old, you should take advantage of it, because Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon-based wines between 10 and 25 years old from good producers are a joy to drink. And few people get that opportunity because they buy them and they drink them immediately.
Right.
If you give those wines 10 to 15 years, they are magical.
Chef, I don't want to take any more of your time, but it's been a true honor and pleasure to have this chat. I hope we can do it again, because we still haven't. I've got a whole scroll of things that we were supposed to talk about we never got to, but we'll see you tonight, and we appreciate the opportunity to sit with you today.
All right.
Thank you. Cheers.